I'm talking about the Jihad movement in West Africa in the 18th and 19th century. And there are three major points that I want to make in my discussion of the Jihad movement that are important in terms of a broader history of the Atlantic world. The first point is that the height of the Jihad movement, which is really from the 1780s through the middle of the 19th century, coincided what in European and in American history is known as the Age of Revolutions. And simultaneously with the Age of Revolutions throughout the Americas and in Europe, there was an age of jihad in West Africa that was not related. There is no direct connection between the events of West Africa and the events of Europe and the broader Atlantic world. However, what is important is that the events in Africa, in West Africa, where the jihad states were established between the 1780s and the 1850 in particular, helped to determine the nature of the broader Atlantic world in several important ways. As you can see, these jihad movements began in the greater Senegambia region, beginning really with Fouta-Bondu in the Senegal River Valley and spreading from there to Fouta-Djallon and then to Fouta-Toro, all in the area of the interior and to the north of Guinea-Bissau. And it was the jihad movement here that subsequently spread eastward all across the Savannah and Sahel regions of Africa as far as the Red Sea that were a defining moment in the shaping of African history in this period. And one of the features of this jihad movement was a desire of Muslims and the Muslim leadership that staged the jihad to actually prevent themselves from being swept up into the Atlantic world. And hence, in a negative way, the jihad movement helped to shape the Atlantic world by its withdrawal from that Atlantic world and its commitment to Islam and its commitment to connections with the Middle East and the larger Islamic world as opposed to the European-dominated world. And it was Muslims such as these individuals whom we're talking about that were in the Senegambia region originally, but all across West Africa, who were involved in this jihad movement. So the first point that I'm making is that the jihad movement helped to shape the Atlantic world, which is a feature of the history of this movement and a feature of African history, which is usually overlooked in our attempts to understand broader global patterns in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was Muslims like these even in places like Ashanti, which was not a Muslim state, but nonetheless was affected by the broader pattern across West Africa that really helped to define West African history. And they did so as intellectuals, they did so militarily, and they did so economically. So that in and of itself, separate from the broader world and global history, which is my point here, is that the jihad movement was a major phenomenon within African history, particularly African history north of the forest regions of West Africa, and indeed stretching all the way to the Red Sea. And so that what we see, what we have to understand in terms of understanding African history in this period is the centrality of this movement. Now, historically, in terms of what scholars know, this is a feature of African history. At least specialists in West Africa understand the importance of the Jihad movement. But I would contend that many Africanist historians even, and certainly historians who were not specialists in Africa, have failed to recognize the significance of this broad pattern. And hence, the Jihad movement requires the same type of historical analysis and the same detail and the same attempt to understand the phenomenon and resistance to that phenomenon as the Age of Revolutions in European history. Now, how did this affect the broader world? Well, in my point here is that Muslims and the Jihad states in particular were reluctant, indeed actively opposed, and legally prohibited the sale of slaves to Christians, the sale of slaves to Europeans. And hence, relatively speaking, very few people came from the areas of the Jihad states who were taken across the Atlantic to the Americas from the last part of the 18th century through the 19th century, when the transatlantic slave trade was at its height. There were Muslims and there were people from these affected areas who did end up in the Americas, but they were unusual, and in my estimation, they constituted no more than 5 to 7% of the total number of Africans that were taken to the Americas in this period. We do see Muslims in Bahia, in Brazil, in significant numbers. We see Muslims scattered in Jamaica, in the United States, and in Saint-Domingue, and in other places in the Americas. But where we find Muslims in the Americas, it's an unusual situation, not a typical situation. And hence it's easy to exaggerate the extent to which Muslims were in the Americas. Yes, they were there, but they were there in relatively small numbers. Because in the Jihad states actually were actively involved in the enslavement of people, and they enslaved people on such a massive scale that by the middle of the 19th century, there were more enslaved people in the Muslim states of West Africa than there were in all of the Americas at any time in history. I repeat that because it's really significant. We find more enslaved people in Africa in the Jihad states than we find in Brazil, the United States, and the Caribbean combined at any point in time. And so that internal slavery within Africa is a phenomenon and a dimension of the Jihad movement which has to be analyzed in great detail. And of course, there are a number of scholars, myself included, who have indeed looked at the phenomenon of slavery in Africa and the extent to which slaves were concentrated in Muslim areas. And we've looked in great detail at the conflict that existed between Muslim areas and non-Muslim areas in West Africa in particular. And we've looked at the extent to which non-Muslims were involved in enslavement of people, and we've looked at many aspects of this. But the one feature that has been overlooked again and again is the fact that the largest number of enslaved people were retained within West Africa. They were not sent to the Americas. They were not sent across the Sahara Desert. They remained in West Africa. And to make this point even stronger, I would suggest that instead of supplying only 5 to 7% of all of the enslaved people that went to the Americas, the Muslim areas of West Africa could have provided 100% of all the enslaved people that went to the Americas, but they did not. In economic history, if an economist sees that the situation could have been that it could have been 100%, but instead was only 5 to 7%, the economists immediately asked questions. Wait a minute, what is going on here? How come this happened? How come this could be that instead of responding to market demand, instead of responding to the prices that could be obtained by selling enslaved to the Americas, there's a big part of Africa that consciously chose not to do so. And that is the part of the global history that is missing. The age of revolutions was indeed a defining moment in the history of Europe, all the way from Russia westward to France, Spain, Portugal, and Britain. And it was indeed a part of the Americas, all parts of the Americas, from Canada as far south as Argentina and Chile. But the realization that world was shaped to a very great extent by the absence of enslaved people from the Muslim areas is a dimension that has been overlooked. While the Jihad movement began in the Senegambia region in the interior of Guinea-Bissau, the height of that movement was centered in what's now northern Nigeria, in Niger, from Burkina Faso all the way to the Central African Republic. And it resulted in the creation of the largest state in African history since the fall of Songhai, and that large state, of course, was the Sokoto Caliphate. And this is the type of transformation that occurred between the end of the 18th century and with the beginning of the Jihad of Usman Dan Fodio, his brother Abdullahi Dan Fodio, and his son Mohammed Bello after 1804. As you see on this map, this is what the political configuration of this region looked like at the end of the 18th century, when this region was generally a major source of enslaved people for the Americas. But it was transformed. And it was transformed in part because the Muslim regime of this region was reacting against the Atlantic slave trade and against the sale of slaves to Christians and to non-Muslims. And the issue of slavery was never an issue that Muslims opposed. What was opposed was the sale of enslaved people to non-Muslims. Why? First, because under Islamic law and under Islamic religion and under Islamic norms and customs, there was a belief that there was always the possibility that anybody who was enslaved had been born, a Muslim had been born free. And that it was the proof, it had to be the responsibility of the master, of the merchant, to prove that somebody could be enslaved and should be enslaved under certain circumstances. This was exactly the opposite of what European conceptions of slavery were all about. In European conceptions of slavery, the burden of proof about freedom rests on the shoulders of the person who's enslaved. An individual had to prove that they were free. Under Islam, it was the master who had to prove that the person could be enslaved. That was a complete opposite of what happened in the Americas and in the European-dominated world. A second feature that was completely different was the inheritance of the status of slave. In Islamic law and in custom and practice, despite exceptions, because we all know that in any legal system and in any moral system, there are exceptions, there's corruption, there are people who misbehave and don't follow what is normal. But the norm is that an individual was born, the status of that individual was inherited from the father, not the mother. Inherited from the father. If the father was free, the individual who was born was free. Now, in European custom and law, it was just the opposite. The status of the person born to somebody of slave status followed the status of the mother, not the father. In fact, the paternity of the father was often denied or ignored or overlooked. All that really mattered was whether the mother was a slave or not. If she was a slave, then the child was a slave. Just the opposite from Islam. What does this mean? In the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate, which swept away the earlier states that existed in the region of Nigeria and its hinterland. Even the state of Borno, which reacted and opposed the Jihad, was completely transformed into a state in the similar way that the Age of Revolution affected all parts of Europe, whether or not a state went through a revolution or not. And what happened in terms of the Sokoto Caliphate, it ended up with a slave population that was larger than the slave population of Brazil. It ended up with a slave population that was probably about the same size as that of the United States at the time of the American Civil War. And one of the dimensions of that, of course, was the destruction of the Oyo state, and it was the destruction of the Oyo state that accounted for so many Yoruba going into diaspora. Whether they were Muslims or whether they were not Muslims, many Yoruba went into diaspora in the 19th century. Some Yoruba were into diaspora before then, but not many by comparison. And it was the concentration of Muslims, and particularly Yoruba Muslims, in Bahia that was the result, that led to the result of a Muslim uprising in Bahia in 1835. So that you do see a connection between the Atlantic world and the Age of Revolutions and West Africa and the Jihad movement, but you only see it in isolated cases like that. So my final point that I want to make in terms of understanding the Jihad movement is a question of what did the enslaved population in West Africa in the Jihad states do? And these slides have shown you various pictures of Kano and different parts of the Sokoto Caliphate, showing the architecture, showing the mosques, showing the frontier settlements that were called Rabat, that were built in order to perpetrate the Jihad movement and to bring more and more territory under the control of these revolutionary Jihad states. Well, one of the biggest things that happened in terms of the enslaved population is that they were put to work growing cotton and making textiles. In the Kano area, for example, which this slide shows you some of the density of population around Kano, it shows you that within about a 50-kilometer radius of Kano City, there were approximately 200 walled towns. And what was the major occupation of the people that lived in these towns and the various villages that were attached to these towns? Besides growing grain crops and food crops, they grew cotton. And they grew cotton so that they could invest in, this is a picture of Kano in the middle of the 19th century, so that they could invest in textile production. And it was in all the Muslim states, but especially in the Sokoto Caliphate, textiles became the biggest industry. So much so that textiles that were produced within West Africa, in the Muslim states, virtually clothed the Sahara, parts of North Africa, and all of West Africa. Now, it doesn't mean that textiles weren't imported too from Europe, from India, of course, because we know people like clothing, and people like as much clothing as they possibly can have. But it would be wrong to think that the textile industry of West Africa was undermined by imports. No, quite the opposite. the textile industry under the Jihad states expanded dramatically, so that around Kano there were at least 15,000 dye pits that dyed indigo-colored cloth and various and then which were then embroidered and which were made into different types of garments that were exported all over the West Africa. There were approximately 50,000 workers at these dye pits. And the only thing, some of these dye pits had as many, locations had as many as 100 dye pits at them. And the only reason they didn't look like a factory in a European sense is because they didn't have a roof over them. But they were concentrated, and the production and the way the scale of production was on an extremely large scale. Why that was important is because one of the features of the Age of Revolution in Brazil, the United States, and Cuba was that there was a period of what historians have referred to as a period of second slavery, an intensification of slave use under the Age of Revolution regimes in the Americas, and that a lot of the economic development on the Age of Revolution depended upon slavery. It was exactly the same in the Jihad states. So that the parallel again with the Age of Revolution is striking. And it's one more point that emphasizes that the African history really has to be understood in a global context to see how it influenced the shape of the modern world.